Okay, class, which I think is just Kelly and Easton at the moment. We'll go ahead and get started with this review. So as you know, exam 3 is on Monday, the 16th. So we already went over chapter 6, so I'm not going to spend much time going over this chapter at all. But one thing I did add for y'all's information is how many questions are broken up into multiple choice, true, false, and fill in the blank. So if you look up here, multiple choice is going to be the bulk of the questions. 15 true, false. I think that's more than the previous exams. So if you struggle with true, false, just a heads up on that. And then fill in the blank, only 5. So not very many fill in the blank, which is probably good news for y'all. But let's go ahead and just look at the chapter 7 review. I didn't really change anything on this from what y'all have, except I just kind of showed you what was on your assignment there. So if you want to have this pulled up while I'm going over the lecture, please do so. I'm going to pull mine to the side and then just share my PowerPoint screen. So give me a second and I will switch that over. All right, so we do want to just kind of start at the very beginning, just talking about, actually, hold on, give me a second. Anyway, yeah, so just kind of starting at terminology. So you will have a few questions on the exam, just basic terms. So pretty simple, just look here, just know these terms. If you can't memorize them, have them written down, look at them while you're answering these questions. There may be about 4 or 5 questions from this slide and then a few other questions from another slide later. It's just knowing these definitions because you have to understand these definitions in order to understand how the respiratory system functions. So this is kind of the first thing you want to know. You do want to know these 4 definitions right here. Next on the exam, you'll have a question about functions of the respiratory system. So pretty simple. We want to understand what is the main role. These 2 up here are the most important roles of this system that we talk about in detail throughout this lecture, but 3 other functions that you will probably see on there, humidifies, warms, and filters. So it's a really good multiple choice question or true false question kind of asking about what does the respiratory system do? So what are the functions? So this slide right here, just know those 5 functions. Know the top 2 are going to be the most important. Next is understanding kind of the structure of the respiratory system, knowing kind of where or kind of where the pulmonary system starts, how it starts up here in the pharynx, goes down through the larynx, and then into the bronchioles. Also knowing where does gas exchange take place, knowing that the only place in this entire system that gas exchange occurs is the alveoli. So we'll talk more in detail about the alveoli in this lecture, but just kind of knowing the pathway of that airflow. If you go to your lecture, if you pull up the animations, it'll show you exactly the path of airflow from where it starts to where it ends. So do understand that path of airflow. Know the alveoli is where gas exchange occurs. This next slide here, we get into diffusion of gases. So we'll talk about that more in detail about the driving forces and the pressure differences and how that allows for gas exchange to occur. But just knowing here, gas exchange, gas diffusion takes place between the capillary and the alveoli. You don't really have to know much about the diaphragm besides that it performs inspiration at rest. And I'll pull up that slide later in a second. But moving on, I don't think there's going to be a question about these three terms right here, knowing the difference between visceral pleura and parietal pleura and the pleural fluid. But you will have a question about this bottom portion. So understanding interthoracic pressure and how that's different than interpulmonary pressure. So interpulmonary pressure, pressure within the lungs, where interthoracic is between the two membranes. And it's referring to these two membranes up here, the visceral and parietal pleura. What you have to know is that that pressure is caused by that fluid. And that fluid allows the lungs to adhere to the interthoracic cavity. So anytime the lungs move, the entire thoracic cavity and the diaphragm also move. So there's a pressure there that allows those structures to stick together during movement of the lungs. So that's exactly kind of what this says here. And also note the pressure in the interthoracic cavity is less than atmospheric. So that allows for all those structures to stick together during movement. So that's going to be an important topic there. And then this here, you probably wrote about this on your assignment a little bit. You'll see questions about this as well, because this may be one of the most important parts of this system is the difference between inspiration and expiration and knowing what all takes place, kind of what happens in the lungs during breathing. So this picture is good. I think the next picture is better, but we can just start here. So interpulmonary, also interpulmonic, same thing. Interpulmonary is just easier to say. So interpulmonary pressure, pressure within the lungs. We have to talk about the difference between pressure in the lungs versus pressure in the atmosphere. So at sea level, we know atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. We know that the pressure within the lungs, that's going to change, but atmospheric pressure will stay the same. So you have to know that when interpulmonary pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure, that's going to cause the air to move out of the lungs, expiration, versus when interpulmonary is less than atmospheric, that causes inspiration. We'll talk about why that is on the next slide. But here, another really important point is in between breaths. So when you're not inhaling in and when you're not exhaling out, there's going to be a few seconds where there's no movement of air. And when there's no movement of air, the pressure is equal. So that's another kind of important thing to know is those few seconds in between taking a deep breath or exhaling, pressure between atmosphere and pressure in the lungs, that's going to be equal. So here, let's just do like a quick overview of inspiration, expiration. So here's our atmospheric pressure. We know 760. And then in between breaths, so at rest, there's no movement, which means the pressures are the same between the two locations. We also know down here, this is a really important statement, and we learned about this in the cardiovascular system when we talked about the movement of blood. Blood and gases move from high areas of pressure to low areas of pressure. So that causes a pressure gradient, causes air or blood to move. So here we look at inspiration. So what happens during inspiration? The lungs expand, which means there's a greater volume, lower pressure. So as the volume expands, as that increases, the pressure gets lower in that area because now there's more room for those gases and those molecules to move around. So when the volume expands, that allows air to rush in because air or whatever blood air moves from high pressures to low pressures. So if the pressure is lower in the lungs, the air is going to move, or the oxygen, out of the atmosphere and into the lungs. So we see here that pressure drops by 2 millimeters of mercury. But then there's only so much we can expand to. So think about expanding your lungs. There's a physiological maximum that we reach. And once we reach that, we have no choice but for those lungs to start recoiling. That's just how our body works. That's how those lungs are designed. So once we inhale, reach that physiological maximum, then the lungs are going to start recoiling. When they start to recoil, that's going to decrease the volume. And now the pressure in the lungs is going to start to increase. So as that pressure increases, the air doesn't want to be in there anymore, so it's going to rush out of the lungs. So that causes expiration. So we see here the pressure as the lungs are starting to recoil, as we're starting to expire, the pressure gets higher. So we see 763 higher than the pressure in the atmosphere. So air rushes out of the lungs into the atmosphere, moving from high to low areas of pressure. So I think that's a pretty easy topic to understand. If you remember that highlighted statement right there, air moves from high to low areas of pressure, then you'll understand inspiration and expiration. This also here talks about Boyle's law, which you wrote about on your assignment, so you should be familiar with, is during inspiration, you have to know what happens. This is also another really good place to ask questions, like a multiple choice question, which of the following does not occur with inspiration. So knowing as you inspire, your lung volume increases. So if the volume of your lung is increased, remember those lungs adhere to the thoracic cavity. So the volume of the thoracic cavity will also increase. But if those increase, pressure decreases. There's an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. So keep that in mind when answering those questions. And then the opposite happens during expiration. Volume of the lungs decrease, interthoracic cavity decreases, but now pressure increases because there's a smaller smaller area for all those air molecules to move around. How does all of that happen? Pressure gradients. Pressure gradients are caused by changing the volume of the cavity. So as the volume changes, the pressure also changes. And as the pressure changes, that's going to cause a gradient. So a gradient is when the air moves from high to low areas of pressure. So another important statement to understand all this. That gets us to Boyle's law, which I basically just explained, and you should be familiar with already. You've written about it, but you still may have a question about it on your assignment. So one bullet point on the review is knowing the difference between all of the laws. So this is probably the easiest law to understand. So if you know this law, you'll be able to identify those other laws or separate them, which we'll get to those other laws later. Now let's talk about muscles. You'll have a question on your exam about muscles. I already said the diaphragm performs inspiration at rest. So at rest, that's really when we're sitting here breathing in, the diaphragm is the only muscle that's really working. So the diaphragm flattens. You would think that the diaphragm would kind of contract as you inspire, but it flattens downward to allow the lungs to get bigger. So just kind of know the role of the diaphragm during inspiration. But during exercise, so now during exercise, we need extra effort to elevate the rib cage. And so 4 muscles here are going to work to do that. You have to know all 4. So external intercostals, they originate upward, so allowing the rib cage to be pulled up. Scalenes and the sternocleidomastoid kind of are up here in the neck and the chest area, pulling also rib cage upward. And then pectoralis minor is one of our pec muscles, pulls it upward. So that's what you want to think about these muscles. These muscles work to elevate the ribs as we inspire. And then opposite down here, we want to talk about expiration. So no muscles are needed during expiration at rest because of that passive recoil of the diaphragm. That elastic tissue, as it expands, just like a muscle, it will slowly recoil, returning back to its original size. Exercise though, or as we force air out of our lungs, we have expiratory muscles. So just 3 you have to know here. These are going to be internal. So we have internal intercostals. Those are the muscles in between the rib cages. So they're going to force the ribs downward. And then internal oblique muscles also originate kind of downward at an angle, pull the abdominals down. And then rectus abdominis, your large kind of 6-pack muscles, that's also going to pull your rib cage down. So when you inspire versus expire, just think about which way is my rib cage are going, and that will help figure out what muscles are involved there. So you do have to know all those muscles. This picture here shows you those muscles, so you can go and look at this on your own. Look at the arrows. That will tell you which muscles are being pulled up and which muscles are being pulled down. All right, so moving on to part 2. So now we get into airflow and what are the factors involved in airflow. So here, let's first talk about what determines how or how much air is flowing to a certain area. So we have 2 factors. We have pressure differences, which we already kind of went over, difference between 2 areas. And then resistance, that one's easy to understand. If there's a resistance, there's going to be less airflow. Same with blood flow. There's a resistance, blood cannot or air cannot move to that area. So how do we increase airflow? We have to manipulate those two variables. So first, starting with amplifying the pressure difference. We just talked about this with inspiration, expiration, the atmospheric pressure versus the interpulmonary pressure. If we amplify the difference, we make one larger and one smaller, air is going to flow faster to a certain area. So it could be flowing faster into the lungs or from one area in the body to another area in the body. And then decreasing resistance. So this could be, when we think resistance, you want to think of the airway, so the diameter, the bronchioles. When we increase the diameter, we have greater flow. When we decrease it, we have a resistance there, so less flow. So just know for the exam, amplifying the pressure and decreasing the resistance. And that's amplifying pressure difference between two areas, decreasing resistance to flow. So yeah, but what about rest versus exercise? So this right here shows that during rest, so me sitting here right now, the diameter of my airway determines how much oxygen is getting into my lungs or how much total air is getting in. But when I start exercising, we see sympathetic stimulation. That's going to be hormones that are released during sympathetic nervous system activity that's going to cause bronchodilation. So allowing dilation of my airways to, allow for more oxygen. So mainly you just have to know this part right here. How do we increase airflow? Here we get to some other terms. I mentioned, and when I started this, that there are lots of terms that you'll see on the exam. So knowing what is tidal volume, what is anatomical dead space, how do we calculate pulmonary ventilation? So I'm not going to spend time going over this, but just have a list of all those terms, be able to fill in the blank for some of those terms, and then others will be true, false, multiple choice. This kind of shows about tidal volume. I think one question you may have is basal versus apical portion of the lungs. So knowing that at rest, we actually use the basal portion of the lungs. And then during exercise, we use the entire portion of the lungs. We use both the top and the bottom. So that may be a question, but it may not be. So just kind of know different portions of the lungs are used at rest versus during exercise. Tidal volume, or these variables here, I don't think you have a question on these variables. You just have to know what each variable represents and what it means. All right, so let's talk about here. So residual volume, that's another term. You do have to know that one. Air left in the lungs after a maximal exhalation. We talked about what's the benefit of residual volume. It allows for gas exchange to still take place in the lungs after we have a maximal exhalation. So there's still gas in there. That's that air left over. And then down here, this is, I know for sure, a question on your exam, talking about depth of breathing versus rate of breathing, and which one happens first during exercise. So think about when you start exercising, what's going to happen? Usually you increase the depth of your breathing. That's going to be tidal volume. So tidal volume is how deep you can go or how much you can expand your lungs during exercise. So depth of breathing occurs first. But as we continue to exercise, there's only so deep we can reach in our lungs. We said we activate all portions of our lungs during exercise, but tidal volume will then plateau, especially during high intensity exercise. And then the rate or the frequency of breathing becomes our secondary source and kind of our only source to further increase pulmonary ventilation. So tidal volume is going to be the first factor to increase pulmonary ventilation, which is breathing, during exercise. But tidal volume plateaus, and then frequency or rate of breathing, which starts to increase kind of as the more intense our exercise becomes, further increasing pulmonary ventilation. So you do have to know that for the exam. All right, now we get into those laws, but first, let's kind of recap gas diffusion. This was a question on your assignment. You had to list the 3 factors that influence gas diffusion or gas exchange at the lungs. A lot of people said surface area, which is true. The alveoli create a very large surface area for gas exchange to occur. The other 2 points you needed to have written down was the thinness of the respiratory membrane, how the gas only has to pass through 2 cell walls, which is the wall of the alveoli and then the wall of the capillary. So the thinness of the membrane and then the difference in partial pressure. So we've been talking about difference in partial pressure. We'll continue to talk about it and we'll get into those driving forces in a little bit. But let's talk about 3 other laws that you do have to know for the exam. So I think Dalton's law is pretty easy to understand too. So understanding total pressure of a gas mixture. So just think about the air. It's the sum of the partial pressure of each gas. So we know that the air that we breathe is oxygen, nitrogen, and CO2. So this picture down here shows that each gas moves according to its own pressure. So we know, let's say gas, and this example is really good. It shows that the total pressure of the gas, let's say in that mixture right there, 752 millimeters of mercury. That's made up of the pressure of nitrogen and the pressure of oxygen. You combine the 2 together and that gives you the total pressure. So that's basically Dalton's law, that each pressure or each gas in a mixture moves according to its own pressure. And those total pressures, when you add them together, that's going to be the entire pressure of that mixture. Basically, just understand those statements and you'll be fine. Fick's law, a little bit harder to understand because we have more variables now, but it's still exactly what we've been talking about the alveoli. So we talk about volume of gas that diffuses is proportional to what? And we have these 4 factors right here. But this is exactly kind of what you wrote about on your assignment when we have the surface area available. So how much surface area, how much room do we have for diffusion to occur? The diffusion coefficient, that has to just do with the ease at which a particular gas moves, and then the thickness of the membrane and the difference in partial pressures. So basically just knowing those 4 variables and just this statement right here that Fick's law has to do with the volume of gas that diffuses. What is it proportional to? Those 4 variables. And then Henry's law is specifically talking about gas dissolving in a fluid. That is going to be oxygen dissolving in blood. So gases are oxygen, fluid is the blood. The amount of oxygen that diffuses into the blood, what is that based on? Based on the temperature of blood, which usually stays relatively constant from rest to exercise. We may see a slight increase in blood temperature, which will increase gas diffusion. Solubility, which is the ease at which a solvent dissolves into a solute, and then partial pressure of gas, which we know is that driving force that allows oxygen to move into a certain area. What you have to know is mainly just the statement right here, how much gas can diffuse into the fluid, which is blood, and then these 3 variables. You don't really have to know what happens to them, but just so you do know is that since temperature and solubility stay relatively constant, the partial pressure of the gas is what determines how much gas dissolves into a fluid. And we're about to get into partial pressures and that diffusion rate. All right, so just kind of summing up, we have the definition of partial pressure. Again, understanding it's how much the proportion of pressure due to the gas in the mixture, which is Dalton's law. The pressure exerted by that individual gas. So atmospheric pressure, we know. This question right here was on your assignment. I think it was the last question, kind of understanding how as oxygen and CO2 travel throughout the body, the partial pressure of those 2 gases is going to change depending on which location they're in. And so that's what we're about to talk about here. So this probably may have been a little confusing for a few of y'all, but let's go over it because it's going to be on your exam. So this is where we get into driving forces. And what is a driving force? It's a pressure that pushes a gas into a certain location. So we talk about here PO2, that's just the pressure of oxygen. We have to have it greater in the alveoli than in the blood because we want that pressure to move from the alveoli into the blood, moving from high to low areas. So we have to get the oxygen from the alveoli into the blood and then from the blood into the tissue, because if we don't get if we don't get that oxygen into the tissue, then we can't have, working muscles. So let's start. We have sea level. We have the pressure of oxygen in the sea level, or sorry, in the air, in the atmosphere. As we inhale, that pressure is going to decrease to 105 from 159. Why does it decrease? Because we talked about that there is water molecules in our respiratory system. And so when the water molecules combine with the air molecules, that decreases the pressure of the oxygen. And then here's the important part. We want to get the oxygen from the alveoli into the blood, entering into the lungs. So if it's entering into the lungs, it means it's deoxygenated. If it's deoxygenated, we want to oxygenate it. How do we do that? We have to get the oxygen from the alveoli into the blood. There's a pressure that's going to push that oxygen into the blood, and that is 65 millimeters of mercury. That's just the pressure there. So it's the pressure that's going to push oxygen from the alveoli into the blood. So that's our gas diffusion. And then that pressure then is going to be that pressure is then going to increase to 100. So now the pressure is higher of oxygen because there's more oxygen now in the blood leaving the lungs. It's going to the tissues. So now we have to get the oxygen in the blood passing over the muscle into the muscle or into the tissue. That pressure is 60 millimeters of mercury. And we see the difference there because 100 millimeter of mercury is the pressure of the blood entering into the muscle, and 40 is the pressure in the muscle. So 60 is the difference. So you just have to know right here that statement. That's the driving force. You will have a question about that. This here just shows that pathway. So this talks about the heart again. So we have the oxygen that the blood that left the lungs, it's deoxygenated, or sorry, now it's oxygenated. It's coming back. So yeah, instead of me going over this again, you can look at this and you can look at those same exact numbers and what we just talked about. The purpose of understanding this is just to understand how we have oxygen get into the bloodstream and then how we have that oxygen get into the muscle tissue. That's the main point of this. You do have to know those driving forces for oxygen and for CO2. So here's CO2. Now we have to think about, we want that blood to leave, or sorry, that CO2 to leave the body because the muscle produces it during exercise. And when the muscle produces it, it's going to move from the tissues into the blood. So here we want to work backwards. So we have partial pressure of CO2 in the tissues, 46, but we want to get that CO2 out of the muscle and into the bloodstream. So now we have a driving force of 6. So the reason it's a lot lower, it's 6 compared to 60, is because carbon dioxide diffuses more easily. So it has a greater coefficient, which means it diffuses more easily into a tissue. It doesn't need as much of a driving force or a pressure pushing it. So here, 6 millimeters of mercury for each location. So now we have the blood entering the lungs. It's full of CO2. So it's full of CO2, but we have to get rid of that CO2. That's what we exhale. So the driving pressure from getting it from the blood in the lungs into the actual alveoli is also 6. And then we can exhale it. So yeah, if I went over this way too quickly, which I know I did, you can go back to the chapter 7 lecture where I talk about this in a lot more detail and a lot slower. But here, this picture just shows the same thing. This is also a really tricky topic to understand. So if you need help understanding this, please reach out to me. It will be on your exam. You do have to know this. All right, so kind of moving on, this critical question or critical thinking question that is in the lecture was basically your case study about Dr. Palmer or Ty, training and altitude and understanding what happens. So you probably know about this already, and you kind of had a question about altitude training, the adaptations. You'll see a question from this infographic on the exam. So do know what happens with high altitude exposure and the adaptations that occur from altitude training. All right, so moving on, now we're talking about hemoglobin and gas transport. So this gets into the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, which was also a question on your on your assignment. So I'm going to go over this pretty quickly, like I've done everything else. So oxyhemoglobin, we know that just means that oxygen is fully bound to hemoglobin. Deoxyhemoglobin, oxygen is not bound to hemoglobin. We know hemoglobin exists in red blood cells. Hemoglobin is a protein iron structure that's inside the red blood cells, and that's how we carry oxygen to our working muscle. So the purpose of understanding about this curve, the whole goal is oxygen delivery to tissue. And these, we'll just talk about factors that determine how much oxygen gets to the muscle. So when you look at this, it's probably a little confusing. Again, I went over this very slowly in the chapter 7 lecture, so go back if you need to. What you have to understand for the exam is just understanding the purpose of this curve and how this curve shifts back and forth from the right to the left, depending on if we're exercising or if we're at rest. And we'll look at 3 factors that determined the shift of this curve. And what all that means is it just determines oxygen delivery. The X and the Y axis, the X axis referring to partial pressure of oxygen in a certain location. So versus in the systemic arteries versus in the systemic veins. We know systemic means pulmonary. We know veins is returning back to the heart, which is going to be lower in oxygen, which has a lower partial pressure. We know systemic arteries are arteries moving to the tissue away from the heart, high in oxygen, higher partial pressure. We see over here percent oxyhemoglobin saturation. This means that the hemoglobin molecule is 100% or 40% saturated with oxygen. It means it's holding on to those oxygen molecules in order for them to be delivered to the tissue. So that's really what the graph means. But here, let's kind of talk about what happens from rest to exercise. So here we see high PO2, partial pressure of oxygen at the lungs, because that's where the alveoli have transported that oxygen into the bloodstream. So high partial pressure at the lungs, we're 100% saturated. Low partial pressure at tissues, because the tissues are using oxygen. So as they use the oxygen, that decreases the partial pressure. So here we have at rest. So at rest, partial pressure of oxygen, about 40 millimeters of mercury. So that means only 20% of oxygen is released from hemoglobin. But we're at rest, which means we don't need a lot of oxygen. As me just sitting here, my muscles aren't working very hard. So they don't need a lot of oxygen that's released to it. But now look at exercise. As the partial pressure decreases further because my muscles are using the oxygen, now 90% of that oxygen is going to be released off of hemoglobin to the tissues. Because my tissues are working, they need more oxygen. So you probably just have to know the difference, maybe the percentages of what's released from rest to exercise, kind of based on that curve. Now let's talk about the 3 factors that determine oxygen release. So increased temperature. We know temperature stays relatively constant at rest kind of throughout the day. Exercise will see a slight increase, but that slight increase is enough to shift the curve, allowing for more oxygen to be delivered to the muscle. So as our blood temperature gets higher, meaning we're exercising, the curve shifts to the right. This here shows in Celsius, but the higher the Celsius, we know the higher the temperature. Decreased affinity for hemoglobin for oxygen. We said that affinity meant attractiveness. So how attracted is that oxygen to the hemoglobin? Decreased affinity means it's going to let go. So if it's let go, more oxygen is released from the hemoglobin to the muscle tissue. Next is acidity. So we know that when we're exercising, we're going to have an increase in acidity of the muscles. The acidity works by, we'll talk about the Bohr effect in a second, but it also shifts that curve to the right. Same thing happens, decreased affinity. So now oxygen cannot bind onto hemoglobin, meaning it's released at the tissues. How does that work? The Bohr effect. The Bohr effect is the acidity, which is those hydrogen ions that are produced, is then going to bind to the red blood cell, preventing oxygen from binding, which meaning the oxygen will let go. So if it lets go, that's actually good because that means we get more oxygen during exercise. Last factor here is a byproduct of glycolysis. So anaerobic glycolysis means we're doing high intensity exercise. That's going to produce something called 2,3-DPG. You can see the real name right here, just a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism. So what happens here? Same thing. As this byproduct is produced, the curve shifts to the right, decreased affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin, meaning oxygen lets go. We get more oxygen to our muscle tissues. And then higher resting levels, that just refers to that athletes and those individuals who live at higher altitude have more 2,3-DPG, that byproduct, allowing their muscles to get more oxygen. Now let's talk about carbon dioxide transport. You have one question on your exam about this, and it's the 3 ways in which CO2 is transported. Very simple. It can be dissolved in plasma. It can also be bound to hemoglobin and transported as bicarbonate. So those are the 3 factors. If you want more information about kind of all of that's on the slides there, go back to the lecture, but that's what you have to know. The 3 ways in which CO2 is transported in the body. All right, so now that gets us to gas exchange in the muscle. So hemoglobin versus myoglobin, you have to know the difference. There's a question on your exam that talks about the difference between the 2. They're very similar because they both bind oxygen. But this picture here shows that hemoglobin is in the bloodstream and it binds 4 oxygen, where myoglobin exists only in the muscle, but it only binds 1 oxygen. So what are the roles here? It does assist in passive diffusion of oxygen. It helps oxygen get out of the out of the bloodstream into the muscle, and then it helps it get into the mitochondria because the mitochondria uses oxygen for energy. So passive diffusion functions as an O2 reserve at the start of exercise. When we start exercising, our body has to use anaerobic metabolism, meaning we're not getting enough oxygen, but that's okay because myoglobin holds on to those oxygens inside the muscle, allowing for that oxygen to be transported to the mitochondria. Even though our muscles aren't really getting enough oxygen, there's still a small reserve there at the very beginning of exercise. And then it's 100% saturated at lower partial pressures than hemoglobin. And we see that by here, this graph. As partial pressure decreases, let's look at down to 0, 10, 20, we see that myoglobin still has really high saturation of oxygen, where hemoglobin, that curve down here, is lower, less saturation. So yeah, those are the 3 main differences, and I talked about the other ones earlier. So again, you have a question on the exam, myoglobin versus hemoglobin. Know the difference. Okay, we've made it to part 4. Let's talk about control of ventilation. So let's just kind of start with what's the purpose of ventilatory control. We have our 3 purposes right here. So maintaining homeostasis, matching our tissue's need for oxygen, and monitoring partial pressure of O2, CO2, and hydrogen. This here is a question on your exam. So knowing what happens. So during exercise, what happens to PO2? It decreases because the muscle tissue is using oxygen, so the partial pressure of it is lower in the muscle. But we have increased PCO2 because the muscle is producing CO2, the partial pressure is higher. And we have an increase in acidity due to it being a byproduct in glycolysis. All of that functions to increase pulmonary ventilation. So that's a question on your exam. You have to be familiar with this statement right here, knowing what happens. Respiratory control center. You also have to know which structure in the brain controls the respiratory center. It's the medulla oblongata. So that's the main control area. You need to know it's the pacemaker of breathing. It controls our rhythmical breathing pattern. It's involuntary because it's controlled by a portion of the brain stem. Yeah, and we'll get into all this feedback right now. All right, so you do not have to know this giant flow chart here. You don't have to know that at all. You just have to know these points over here. So rate and depth of breathing, that's frequency of breathing and tidal volume. What is it modified by? Chemoreceptors. You know what chemoreceptors are? They monitor chemicals in the blood or in the air or in the gas in our muscles. So peripheral, central, we'll look at those in just a second where they're located. Neural input, that's just the motor cortex. We have other neural inputs in muscle and lungs. And then it kind of goes into more information about those chemoreceptors and the neural input. For the exam, let's see. I think you just have to know in general what factors are modified by the RCC. It's just chemoreceptors, motor cortex, kind of what we see on this picture here. So just know you have your chemoreceptors. They're in carotid arch and carotid bodies, or sorry, aortic arch and carotid bodies. Lung receptors, proprioceptors, central chemoreceptors, motor cortex. You just kind of really have to know medulla is the respiratory control center, and it's going to modify all of these different inputs that I have here that are circled or highlighted. Next, let's talk about how all of those inputs work during exercise. So once we start exercising, so the second we start, our ventilation increases pretty rapidly. So we see abrupt increase in pulmonary ventilation. What is that due to? It's due to the motor cortex. So the motor cortex, it senses our movement and it sends that information to the respiratory control center, and it starts increasing our breathing. We also have feedback from our active muscles. Those proprioceptors send that information to the spinal cord, kind of help to increase our breathing. Next here, we hit steady state, and then we have kind of a leveling out. That fine tuning of ventilation kind of also occurs. What's that going to be due to? Phase 2 and phase 3 are due to the peripheral and central chemoreceptors. So that's what the steady state area is, fine tuning, just keeping a normal breathing pattern. And then this here talks about maximal exercise, what happens. We actually kind of surpass all of these phases and we still just see this steady increase in our pulmonary ventilation up until we hit VO2 max. So our maximal air that or oxygen that we're able to consume. And then what is this due to? It's due to that increase in acidity and decrease in blood pH above lactate threshold, that we're exercising at such a high intensity that our pulmonary ventilation just keeps increasing, and it can barely keep up. So what happens here? Our peripheral chemoreceptors are stimulated, just further increasing our ventilation. And then we also keep breathing mainly to exhale that CO2 because our body's producing a lot of CO2 due to those working muscles and we have to get rid of it. So we're going to keep breathing, yes, to get oxygen, but more so to exhale all of that CO2. And that does help to decrease the acidity. All right, so ventilatory equivalents. If you go back to the lecture, just kind of listen to this slide, understand how these equivalents help define ventilatory threshold. I am pretty sure you're going to have a question on the exam about ventilatory equivalents of oxygen and CO2, meaning how many liters of air do we have to ventilate in order to obtain 1 liter of oxygen, and then how many liters of air do we have to ventilate to exhale 1 liter of CO2. So go back to your lecture to get those 2 numbers right there if you don't have them already. There's also a question about ventilatory threshold. So this here is, it's anaerobic threshold. It's similar to lactate threshold. Anaerobic threshold is So it's basically when we're exercising and then we still continue to see an increase in the ventilatory equivalents of oxygen, where we're still ventilating air to obtain more oxygen, but there's no change in the amount of air we're ventilating to exhale CO2. It's basically when our intensity of exercise increases to a point at which aerobic metabolism can't keep up anymore, because we need oxygen at a faster rate. And aerobic metabolism, it's very slow, where we now are going to switch to anaerobic metabolism because our energy demands are greater. We need more ATP faster. We need it at a faster rate. So we have to switch to anaerobic metabolism. But the problem with that is that we see an increase in acidity. And that's what this anaerobic threshold is. It's the point at which we switch from aerobic to anaerobic to receive energy at a faster rate. So you will have a question about this. I would just know these two paragraphs right here. So this paragraph right here, and then this paragraph at the bottom. Know the definition of ventilatory threshold. And then kind of last slide is you'll have a question about this. This is ventilatory or ventilation limits and adaptations. So what you need to know is about the diaphragm. So force output, when does force output of the diaphragm decrease? So what percent of VO2 peak does the diaphragm kind of slow down in its ability to contribute to that work and recruit other muscles during exercise? And then this one right here, knowing that the diaphragm can hypertrophy, but it can only hypertrophy with resistance training or manual labor. It cannot hypertrophy with aerobic exercise. So aerobic exercise, we won't see any diaphragm hypertrophy, but we will with resistance training. And then oxidative capacity will increase with endurance training. So just meaning the oxidative capacity of all those muscles involved in the respiratory system will increase with endurance training. So just kind of know those points right there. Adaptations, you will have a question on the exam about adaptations to the respiratory system. So what changes will occur with increased training? So your quiz is tomorrow. So chapter 7 quiz is on Friday. This is a pretty, again, you know how quizzes are. You only have a few more left. But yeah, so this is what I would make a little review for your quiz, sit down, take your quiz with that information in front of you in order to get the best score. All right, so summing up, just to prepare you for the exam, this exam I think is very tricky because there's a lot of variables. Cardiovascular and respiratory I think are pretty hard, but here's some questions to help you prepare. So these were on your video lectures that you saw. So these are just some points that you just need to be really familiar with. Path of blood flow through the heart, acute changes with exercise, chronic changes with exercise. When we have an increased plasma volume, what else happens? Intrinsic versus extrinsic control, factors that influence blood pressure in the body. So these are some kind of main questions. And then here, main questions about chapter 7, talking about inspiration, partial pressure of oxygen, gas diffusion, oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, altitude, these variables here. So if you can answer these questions, you'll be pretty good on the assignment. I have the answers to them, but I'm not going to show them. So if you want to answer these on your own, and then if you want the answer, just email me and I can let you know if you're correct or incorrect. But I want you to figure this out on your own. This is another way to help you study, help you prepare. But then if you answer some of these and you want to know if you're on the right path, let me know and I can talk you through or give you those right answers. But yeah, so that's all I have for this review session. I know I only have like 3 people here, but if anyone wants to ask me a question, now is the time to do so.
Oh, geez. Ugh. Okay, so when it comes to specifics of oxygen diffusion,
Yes.
what do we exactly need to know again? Like, I know you said it's like a complicated process and
Yes. So
something we need to go over.
there are two different places that oxygen diffuses. So you need to know difference between oxygen diffusion at the lungs versus oxygen diffusion in the capillaries, like into the tissue. So at the lungs, oxygen diffusion, that kind of question was on your assignment. So you probably got it right. It's just knowing in the lungs, we have a great amount of surface area. So we're going to have greater oxygen diffusion, partial pressures of oxygen, and the thinness of the respiratory membrane. So those are the three factors that allow for gas diffusion in the capillaries, in the lungs. And then knowing at the tissue, mainly just that driving force. So the force that's going to push oxygen into the muscle. So those are kind of the factors that determine oxygen diffusion.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. All right, well, I probably won't have any more questions, but if you think of one, please let me know. Reach out to me anytime. But your quiz is tomorrow and your exam is on Monday. And then our last Zoom session is going to be chapter 8, and it's going to be on a Wednesday. It's on the last day of our scheduled class, which is Wednesday, December 2nd at 9 a.m. So I hope to see you there to go over chapter 8 and to prepare for the final exam. But yeah, other than that, y'all have a lovely weekend, and please reach out to me if you need anything. But yeah, I will have your assignments graded by the weekend. Okay, I will see you guys later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul.
Bye.